and we will move forward to the second session that is dealing with the addressing. I think it's probably one of the greatest sessions we have, throughout this summit. But it's addressing present and future civil unrest within the cities. And the moderator that we have is a friend of ours from the AHC, Ron Prater. He's the executive director of the Big City Initiatives and Emergency Managers, as well as the Chief Operating Officer at Ben Ear Solutions and Esri Solutions platform. But Ron, without further ado, I'll pass this over to you and get the panelists on board and moving forward with this important topic.
Excellent, John. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for y'all's flexibility. I believe the panelists are on. And we actually don't have any slides, so you probably take the slides down if you don't mind, John. So very brief introductions. Again, I'm Ron Prater and will serve as the moderator for today's panel on civil unrest in the major United States cities. Before we get started, just a little about me. As John mentioned, I am the executive director of Big City Emergency Managers, as well as the chief operating officer of Ben Ear Solutions. Big City Emergency Managers, or BCM, if you're not familiar with this group, is a small not-for-profit that includes the directors of emergency management from 15 of the largest jurisdictions in the country. Together, they serve over 20% of the nation's population. I'm now fortunate that I'm going to introduce our panelists. They are part of the BCM community, as well as good friends of mine. First, we have Curry Mayer. She is the director of the City of Seattle's Office of Emergency Management. Prior to becoming the director, she served as the emergency manager for the city of Bellevue, Washington. Prior to that, she was in California, where she supported both state and local emergency management programs. She has over 25 years of experience in Homeland Security and emergency management, and recently co-authored a book, The Future of Emergency Management After 2020, The New, the Novel, and the Nasty. Next, we have Matt Mueller, who is the executive director of the City and County of Denver Office of Emergency Management. In this role, he is not only in charge of strategic oversight of the office, but he also serves as the chair of the UASI, chair of the Securing the City's Executive Committee, the chair of the Local Emergency Planning Committee, and he serves on the Governor's Homeland Security Advisory Council. He has dedicated more than 20 years, to emergency management and humanitarian assistance. And finally, we have Dr. Chris Rodriguez, who is the director of the Washington, D.C. Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. In this role, Chris serves as the director's Homeland Security Advisor and State Coordinating Officer. Over the last few years, he has also served as the incident commander for some of the district's most complex simultaneous emergency responses. Prior to HCEMA, Chris was the director of New Jersey's Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, and prior to that, he was with the CIA. I'm also proud to say that Chris serves on the BCM board. Now let's jump on some remarks by the panelists. I'll start. So topic one for the panelists, and I'll start with you, Max. I see you first. Looking in the past, what did civil unrest look like in your city? Kind of what was the mindset going on where all this chaos was happening?
Sure. So I think in Denver, what we had experienced prior to May of 2020 with the George Floyd protests was primarily protests around a lot of environmental activism, activism around indigenous American rights. And of course, we had the nation's largest 420 celebration, which always morphed from sort of party to activist protest type atmosphere that we had to navigate for many years. All of that was generally pretty manageable, but what took place in May of 2020, while we were then still in the shelter in place or stay at home orders for COVID, after what happened with the killing of George Floyd, really went far beyond anything that had preceded that. And part of the challenge in Denver is, if you're familiar with Denver at all, we're also home to the state capitol, and our city hall is on one side of Civic Center Park and the state capitol is on the other. And so it provides this confluence where people can come and sort of hit all of it in this half-mile radius of all the things to be able to protest are right there. And so it was this concentration of what turned out to be sort of destruction of city property, of the businesses in the surrounding area, and really forced us to think about structure protection, maintaining that critical infrastructure in proximity of downtown that we never really had to do in any of those previous scenarios with that. You know, the other challenge that we had during that time, as a lot of major cities did, is our population of persons experiencing homelessness in that period. Really with the stay-at-home order and the inability of some of those populations to socially distance, our shelters quickly became overwhelmed. We couldn't open up new ones fast enough. And so a tent city was established right at the foot of the state capitol, which had thousands of people in it. And so this protest activity was going on all around this sort of tent city. And it just became very, very difficult for us as a city to sort of safely manage, protect the First Amendment rights of the people to protest, but also just protect the safety of our citizens, as well as our legislators, our first responders, all of that. And so very much that was this change in the mindset of how we approach things here in the last couple of years.
Excellent, thank you. Curry, I'm going to jump to you next in Seattle on the far west coast. Can you talk about the past a bit?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, happy to be here. So I'll start by saying, as all of you probably know, the history of Seattle protest had been sort of a kind of open, progressive. People did that on a regular basis and was just seen as part of the culture here. We did have a pretty eventful protests during WHO, but that was quite some time ago. So after the death of George Floyd, I'm sure you all saw on the news that the protests for Seattle were quite intense, and included some kind of ancillary consequences for businesses being destroyed that were not all related to the protest, but happened around the same time. So there was a lot of destruction to both city and business property. A lot of businesses have still not come back. And a lot of the downtown area is still pretty sparse in terms of how people are coming back. And a lot of businesses have gone out of business. Probably the most interesting change is that we're still seeing things happening because of the protests from 2020. And you may have also heard this in the news. Most recently, it was discovered that the police department used a ruse and reported that some white supremacists were part of the CHOP on Capitol Hill. The Capitol Hill had been overtaken by different groups of protesters, and things were blocked off, and the police department put out information that a white supremacist group was also there to try to get people to disperse. It had the opposite effect. And this is just now being discovered. So there's a lot of conversation and some deep discussions about what is appropriate or not for law enforcement. There's also been a lot of change in Washington state overall in terms of what types of force and kinds of force that law enforcement can use. Seattle has always had more strict requirements on law enforcement for the use of force, so much so that some of our neighboring jurisdictions will not come into Seattle to help law enforcement here. One of our neighbors in particular, Bellevue, tends to come on a regular basis, but that has definitely impacted how law enforcement here in Seattle does their work. So it's interesting, in the last year or so, even we're kind of in this funky, kind of in COVID, kind of recovering situation. There has been a lot less really sporadic civil unrest, nothing at the size or scope that happened in 2020, but those ancillary things, as I mentioned, are continuing to have an effect. So how law enforcement does its work, whether or not jurisdictions will help us, and then really statewide looking at the use of force. It also had a tremendous effect on our business community, and they're still kind of reeling from that. A lot of businesses are not, some have gone out of business and some have just decided that they don't need to be downtown at all. There was quite an exodus also of people that lived in the city moving to other places, not so much because of the unrest, but because of the working from home. However, that hasn't changed rental or housing prices, so I'm not sure why that is. But definitely those are the major factors that have changed for Seattle.
Thank you, Curry. All right, so Director Rodriguez, over to you and HCMA, and what did the past look like? You know, you had a lot, especially with January 6th, obviously. How did civil unrest, how'd that play out in the city?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And, thanks everyone for joining the call, and particularly to Matt and Curry, who've worked closely with, particularly as all of our cities have dealt with a lot of social unrest over the last couple of years. I think in the District of Columbia, we have some unique challenges in terms of how we provide public safety, also opportunities as well. And just to step back, in the district, we have 40 different law enforcement agencies, including at the sort of state and local level, the federal level, everything from a university police department to the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the lead DC police agency. And so, as you can imagine, as emergency managers, coordination among not just 40 different law enforcement agencies at any given time, but even among and between local, federal, and state agencies within the district and in the region, in Maryland and Virginia, can be challenging at times. All that said, what we've seen over the last couple of years, and particularly Matt mentioned the murder of George Floyd, and I know that played out in Seattle with Curry as well, is we just saw an overwhelming response on the ground in the district. Many of that compounded by the fact that we were dealing with a global pandemic, as many of our cities were, and just I think the frustration of staying home and mask mandates and all these different changes to our lives, I think was almost, for lack of a better term, a perfect combination of distress, I think, that the public, not just in the district, but outside and all across the country felt. And oftentimes, the nation's capital is ground zero for a lot of that social unrest and how it manifests itself for people coming to the Capitol to redress their grievances. And so what we saw in May and June of 2020 was just this overwhelming response where, again, in a lot of our cities, parts of the city just burned. And I think, for a lot of us and the people who work for me, for our local police department, it was shocking and something we hadn't seen in decades. And you combine that with, in the district at least, the deployment of U.S. military forces within the city, armed, and you created a very challenging situation for our residents, our visitors, for people who live there part-time. And that really, I think, instilled a lot of fear in our residents and in the people who are responding to that. And I think it's something that kind of carried through to the presidential election, which as a city we were planning for. No matter who won the election, whether it's the current president or the former president, we knew that there would be a period of social unrest and disruption in Washington, D.C., that it would be a tight election, it would be close, a winner wouldn't be declared on election night, it would probably take several days or weeks, and that would create this environment where different sides of the political aisle could come to the district and really cause some problems. What we saw in the fall of 2020 was, at least on 2 different occasions, large crowds coming into the district, one on November 14th, about a week after President Biden was declared the winner, really coming in the tens of thousands. And while a lot of those protests were very peaceful during the day, there were some isolated arrests at night as counter-protesters started coming out to challenge those particular groups. We did see some violence. Likewise, on December 12th, we saw, again, a similar turnout of the former president's supporters. And again, counter-protesters coming in and sort of creating an environment where we did see some violence. All of that led up to January 6th, and we can talk about that. I know part of the presentation, Ron, but just briefly, coming out of December and seeing a lot of the social media traffic and sort of posts that were out there, we knew, I think when I say we, I think it was the collective sort of information sharing and intelligence sharing apparatus within the district and in the region, and indeed, I think across the country, that January 6th would be something different. And I think as we postured for that, we got to a point where, in some respects, we as a collective enterprise had the intelligence that showed that there would be something different there. I think in some cases, the posturing operationally and how we could have done better. I know there's a lot of investigations going into that right now, and that's something we could also talk about. But I think if someone were to tell you, oh, we knew that something would happen at the Capitol, I don't think they'd be being honest. I think all of us probably on this call can never imagine what playing out. Again, I think it was an unprecedented time. But what it did do, I think, after that is we have seen a lot greater cooperation and information sharing, particularly with our federal partners. Because the city, I think what January 6th showed is, despite the fact that we are a federal district, the city has a role to play in protecting even federal assets. And so that coordination and that cooperation is absolutely critical. And I'm happy to say we have seen a lot of improvements in our abilities to be involved in those operational planning processes prior to any First Amendment activities or demonstrations that we think could be troublesome. So I'll turn it back to you, Ron.
Thank you, Chris. I'll remind everybody, if you have a chat or if you have a question, you put in the chat and I'll be watching that as well. But Chris, I wrote down a quote you just had, which was, nobody could imagine what played out. And it reminds me kind of COVID too. In the pandemic planning, people kind of never thought it would be that big and that long. And it was very difficult to plan for. So, we talk a lot about this in BCM, that emergency managers' jobs are, you all are planners, you're conveners, you're facilitators. So as you think about the future and the complexity of future civil unrest combined with things like homelessness, COVID, natural disasters, supply chain issues, they all happen at the same time, right? They don't wait for one to end for the next one to start. So as you all try to wrap your heads around the future of all this and civil unrest, like what's going on now, what's going on in your mind in the future to try to calm some issues as we move forward. I don't know who, Chris, you want to start this time?
Sure, I can start. Thanks for the question. I know that, and we've talked about this at BCEM, emergency managers are being asked to do so much more, I think, than we were even pre-pandemic. I know a lot of my counterparts across the country are involved in the gun violence prevention efforts, homelessness as well, supply chain disruption, severe weather. And so it's these big issues that emergency managers are being asked to tackle. But one of the things I think BCM really helps us do, and we spent a lot of time at our last meeting talking about it, is how do we advocate for more resources in that environment? We're not resourced at the level of a police department or a fire and EMS department. And so how do we get our executives to begin sort of resourcing us at the level of their expectations of our agencies? And a lot of that's about leadership. A lot of it is about your own ties to your executive, whether it be a governor or a mayor. And so I think that's a challenge for us, and something that we have to continue to advocate, because the day will come where, like a January 6th or with another pandemic, where we are going to be asked to step up, and we're going to have to ask our employees to do the same thing. So how are we taking care of them? How are we being resourced at a level that meets, and even in some cases exceeds, the expectations of our principals?
That was great, Chris. Thank you. Matt, how about you?
Yeah, I'll just kind of tack on to that. I think something that was very telling for us recently is we just got done with a 2-week EOC activation for continuity of government. And the staffing crisis that we're all experiencing as part of the Great Resignation that's been underlying for months and months and will continue to go on, but then compounded by the Omicron-induced variant and the call-outs that the city had, we reached a point where we could no longer maintain some of our essential functions as a city. We were concerned that if there was a riot in the jail, we had no way to control it. We didn't have enough law enforcement to be able to respond to 911 calls. We didn't have enough 911 call takers. And so some calls were waiting 45 minutes to get answered. And so we were tasked with, in emergency management, of being creative. Try to find a solution. This is normally, we're talking about staffing, or we're talking about financial incentives to retain staff. Is not something you traditionally think of emergency management about, but I think it's indicative to what Chris was saying of, in this sort of current environment where everything, whether it's supply chain or persons experiencing homelessness or opioid crisis, becomes an emergency. And thus the level of response and intensiveness of resources is such that they come to us saying, we got this problem, we don't know how to solve it, we just know it's a crisis, figure out a way to get it done. And that does require resources. I think, to Chris's point, I think we're fortunate in Denver that our mayor's office has been good to give us resources from other agencies to pull in to then help problem solve this and make it very intensive. But again, I wholeheartedly agree sort of with Chris's assessment that the landscape of emergency management and what we're being asked to problem solve for isn't just the big snowstorm or when something goes boom anymore. It is a lot different, the nature of what we're facing going forward.
Getting more complex every day. Curry, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree with Matt and Chris that we really are seeing a wide expansion of what emergency management is asked to at least participate in and be part of the solution. That being said, I think this is an opportunity and also a challenge, and a challenge in that, first of all, we need some rebranding. People still don't understand what emergency management does, and we're not managing the emergency. We're maybe managing the consequences with a number of our partners, but I think it would be helpful, and this is the opportunity, that we think about it or help the public and those not directly involved in emergency management think of what we do in a different way. It's really about community resilience, which requires resilience building, which needs to be done all the time, not just, and I think that we do that as a matter of course in emergency management, but that is less well known. So connecting with those community or private sector partners that don't yet know what we do, and look at how do we help communities be more resilient prior to some other kind of event, making sure they understand what resources are available and how they connect to the work that we're doing in emergency management and other parts of government. I think people also in general tend to not understand how the government will help you. That funny kind of cliche thing about, we're the government, we're here to help. We actually do have a lot of ways and resources and things that can be helpful and that not enough people know about. I think one of our challenges is always who are we not connected to and how do we find them? So I think it's this ongoing thing. The opportunity then also for us in emergency management, and what also has changed, is helping people understand how we have this big picture situational awareness and connections to all those partners that I don't know that any other discipline has, and the benefit of that, and how we can really be kind of the moderator, translator, convener, all of those things that emergency management does really well and gives a better overall situational assessment. That's really important, especially with something like civil unrest. I think it's also important to look at how it's changed what our partners in public safety are doing, how the past of civil unrest has changed what our public safety partners are doing, be that what I mentioned earlier about the change in use of force, but just kind of also that I know there's also a lot of conversation here on the West Coast about how do we have conversations, how does public safety engage in less lethal responses to things, mental health crisis, and all these other types of things that are happening that maybe will help with prior to actually some of the civil unrest happening. That, of course, doesn't answer, what happens when there are things like with the elections and other things that don't have anything to do with that. But I think that's helpful. And also, so the community resilience building and the conversation about that big picture situational awareness and how that helps, I think are big opportunities for us in emergency management, and I think will make a huge difference.
Thank you all for talking about the past and the future. There are some really good questions in the chat. I'm going to jump to those before I go into any more I have. So the first one we'll look at is Rosemary McDaniel. Hopefully I pronounced her last name right. She says, how can an emergency manager build in more partnerships that would prevent such issues as January 6th? More people had to know what was planned and what the pulse of the crowd. So Chris, because it's about January 6th, I'm going to look at you first about, how would you build in more partnerships, and what are you doing to form those partnerships today? And then I'll go to Matt and Curry again.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. So, and thanks, Rosemary, for asking the question. With January 6th, I think it's important to sort of bifurcate a couple lines of effort prior to that event or that day. A lot of us, again, I mean by us, I mean sort of the federal and the local police departments and Homeland Security entities were communicating. And I think we all saw similar intelligence, which suggested large crowds, and which did signal the potential and even the likelihood of violence in and around some of our major landmarks in the city. What I think we do, and so the intelligence and the threat picture was pretty consistent across all of our partnerships, and that was and that was facilitated by the fact that we did have those strong partnerships. I think your question is important because those partnerships have to be deepened and actually made more substantive. And what I mean by that is, what are the operational and tactical plans that our partners have in place to protect assets under their jurisdiction? I think in those cases, that information was compartmentalized. It was, I believe, not widely shared, and perhaps for good reason. One of the things that I think has come out from the investigations into what happened on January 6th is the fact that one of the things that challenges the city of Washington, D.C., and that is the mayor of the District of Columbia's jurisdiction, is that it did appear, as you look back at the planning for January 6th, there wasn't a coordinating federal entity that was sort of like running point, as we do as emergency managers in our jurisdictions, on leadership coordination calls. You get the director of the Department of Transportation, the police chief, the fire chief. You're saying, hey, do you have what you need? What are you looking at? How are you posturing? And so I think at the federal level, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of better coordination between those federal entities and making sure that the local entities also have that information. I think there was a gap there. And so those relationships, I think, just need to be deepened and made more substantive. But I think that is going to be a challenge because a lot of agencies, we all work in government at some point, a lot of agencies are reluctant to share that type of real granular information.
Thank you. All right, and Matt, to you on that question about partnerships.
Sure, just real quick, I'll add on. For us, I think the private sector engagement is critical. Just give you an example, actually, even today from some of our hospital systems through the network, we were made aware of I believe it's the February 1st movement to disregard all public health orders and basically give up on all of that. And so that came through some of our private sector hospital system that came through. But some of the other things, a lot of the intel that we get through we have a downtown Denver partnership of the businesses in the urban core and our Chamber of Commerce and groups like that. And that's really critical because law enforcement can only do so much. Emergency management can only do so much. Everybody's sort of the force multiplier of having the private sector saying and having the ability and the channel to communicate that information back to us so then we can make sure we get it shared out really is critical as well.
About you, Curry, on the partnerships.
Yeah, I think it's really focused up, I agree both with Chris and Matt, and I think the private sector is really critical. And I think they're hungry for communication from us and my experience has been that they're hungry to connect. And I think it's, goes back to, it really is something that you have to constantly pay attention to and thinking kind of outside of normal channels, who are we not yet connected to and how can we do that? Sometimes it's just reaching out to those and then connecting through other community partners. I think we forget that, like, oh, I've exhausted and I know all these people and there isn't anyone else. Of course, we wouldn't say that, but the chamber and some of those other through partners and partners connections, I have found to be especially helpful.
Thank you all. Yeah, I'm gonna go back to the questions in the chat because there's another really good one I like from Mitch Erickson. And he asks, what are the physical logistic challenges when outside forces like the National Guard are called in and do not have a police station or somewhere to go? This obviously applies more to just civil unrest, but maybe wildfires and other things. So Curry, I'm going to go back to you first about the physical logistical challenges of partnerships.
We had during 2020, we did have National Guard help. And the private sector relationships we had were the most useful in helping find them places to stay. We got a couple of restaurants to donate food. We had food delivered. So it goes back to making those partnerships ahead of time and don't expect that government can do it by themselves. We were also kind of in a unique situation that hotels were not booked because it was COVID. And so they had extra space and could do that. But I think it goes back to partnerships.
Matt, how about you?
Yeah, we got to be quite a bit of using the National Guard here in the last couple of years, not only for the protest activity and social unrest, but also for the winter storm that we had here. And then the wildfire reference, while not in Denver, you might have been aware of the Marshall Fire in Boulder County that was just outside of Denver that was really significant as well. So the Guard has been a great resource. I think when we talk about logistical challenges, one of the things to know is that the Guard is limited in how many people they can deploy on a moment's notice. That they, like everybody else, those folks have other jobs that they then have to bring in. So if you don't have advance notice, you're limited. And so that's part of the planning factor of, if we're talking about asset protection, we know that we can get 40 Guard personnel within 8 hours, and then we can get an additional 100 more, but it's up to 48 hours later to be able to do that. The other thing that's a bit of a challenge is what the Guard has in terms of if we're talking about protection or unrest, what sort of ammunition are they carrying? Are they using lethal or non-lethal with that? And because they're not necessarily familiar with the laws in the city and county of Denver, they don't necessarily have body cameras, which we require for law enforcement to do in order to enforce laws. There's all these logistical and administrative challenges of how we can use them and in what way that's not going to violate laws to cause more problems and be effective with that. So just some more considerations for the Guard.
Thank you. Chris, how about you on the logistical challenges?
I don't have much to add beyond what Curry and Matt were saying. So I would just limit my comments to say it's obviously different in the district. We are not a state, and so we don't have like a state entity to go through to request National Guard resources. So for us, it's more complicated. Our request for DC National Guard resources has to go through the Department of Defense. In some cases only to the Secretary of the Army, but in others all the way up to the Secretary of Defense for any mission assignments or requests that we have. So it's it's obviously very different than I think our more traditional state counterparts.
Thank you. Man, there's some great questions coming in the chat. I'm gonna keep going down their list. Actually, this one's an interesting one. I'm gonna start with Chris because he owns his fusion center in DC. What role can you see the fusion centers playing in increasing information sharing beyond law enforcement as part of EM? Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And as you mentioned, in DC, the State Fusion Center resides in the Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, which I lead. It is not with the police department. That happened, I think, almost a decade ago. And I think what that does actually is provide a lot of additional resources and expertise for us on the emergency management side. On the law enforcement side, our DC Council just passed legislation that made the Fusion Center itself a law enforcement entity for the purposes of information sharing and intelligence sharing, collection and dissemination. So we are receiving through CJIS, the Criminal Justice Information System, the DOJ's system, all of the law enforcement information that's coming in from across the country. And so that's very helpful for us on the man-made threat side, the terrorism side. On the emergency management side, what we actually do is we've paired up our Fusion Center with our planners, with our preparedness bureau, with our response, readiness, and coordination entities. And so that allows our intelligence analysts to help the emergency management side really think about issues that could be coming up across all hazards, not just on law enforcement sort of criminal activities. And we are, it's still a work in progress. Not surprisingly, our intelligence analysts and our emergency management specialists are kind of coming at problems sometimes from different perspectives. But what my senior staff and I try to really reinforce to our workforce as we try to bridge the gap between both of these professions and enterprises is that information sharing is information sharing is information sharing, and preparedness is preparedness. I mean, whether it's for a terrorism event or for a severe, weather event, we all sort of employ similar approaches to problems. And both entities can learn from the other. And so it's actually extremely useful for us to have the Fusion Center because it does allow us to draw on those resources.
Thank you. Hey, Curry, what are your thoughts on the Fusion Centers and sharing information with the emergency managers?
Yeah, so the Fusion Center here in Washington, and we have an office here in Seattle, has been really good about expanding the information that they provide to emergency management. They've been much more, I'm not sure what the word, they've been seeking out emergency managers to provide information and doing it in a different way, knowing that there's always going to be information that is not going to be released to everyone. They've also, so we get updates on a regular basis, also knowing that that there is some information that can't be shared with local government. But I've been impressed. They've also been asking for a lot of feedback on whether or not what they're releasing is helpful and what else can they do to be supportive of emergency management here in Washington. So it's been a good relationship, and I think it definitely helps in terms of situational awareness and thinking about what are those things, what are the cyber threats, what are the other things that are coming up for them that can be helpful in our planning and preparedness and awareness. And I think cyber is probably the one that sticks out the most for me most recently, because we're all in this type of environment.
Very true. Matt?
I'll just say that I think in Colorado, the state's fusion center maybe isn't quite as progressive as what I'm hearing Curry and Chris talk about with theirs. I think they're very good with things that are more of a traditional criminal nature with that. And then I think they do a pretty good job with cyber. I do think, particularly with this discussion point, the topic of domestic violent extremism is something where I think there is some room for improvement with that. And probably some of that is on me as the local emergency manager to push them to try to do more in that space to really support us. But in the perfect world, and kind of what I'm hearing from Chris and Curry, that's eventually what we would like to get more towards.
Thank you. So I know we have about 5 minutes left, but there's several questions. I think probably this next one, though, could probably be a 3-hour panel just by itself. I think it's a really cool question that we touch on all the time in BCM, at least the last couple of years. It comes from Jamie. And I'll start with Matt this time. How do you factor in the impact of inequity? How do you factor the impact of inequity? How does it play in creating resilient communities? Are there new or emerging challenges you are currently facing?
Yeah, great question. So the question of equity, I think, has really been at the forefront, and I'll give FEMA credit, and certainly Administrator Criswell, I think, has done a great job in just her short time on the job of pushing the questions around equity and how we respond to emergencies and we recover in the equitability of that. And that's certainly something at the local level in Denver we've been doing as well. Everything from when we write our EOC action plans, of every action that we take, we have a very short equity review process to sort of force us to look through and say, okay, which populations of the community are being impacted by this, which in a good way, which maybe in a negative way, and how we assess that. And so I don't necessarily have the great answer of what's the solution to this, but it is the recognition of it and the forcing ourselves as we go through, whether we're talking about longer term planning documents like emergency operations plan or our hazard mitigation plans, as well as the short term ones like our incident action plans, to go through that process of really looking at it and saying, let's figure out and make sure we understand what these impacts are on all the different communities, because in some cases we're doing good here and we're maybe not doing so good here, or we're taking people that are already a step behind and pushing them even further back.
Excellent, Matt. Thank you. I'll go to Chris and then I'll end up with Curry. Chris.
Yeah, I think this issue of equity, as Matt said, is appropriately being emphasized, particularly at the federal level, and then at FEMA, and then of course in our own emergency management agency. So we are in the process of in our agency of hiring our first diversity, inclusion, and equity officer, who can help us really look at how we administer our programs, how we think about even things like our grant funding, and are we using those grant funds in a way that is equitable and assisting our community and providing the vital services that we do. And so I think over the next year, we as an emergency management agency are really going to develop a plan for how to do that, and take a hard look at our programs and our services to make sure that we are doing it in an equitable, we're providing the services in an equitable way. So I look forward to a lot of the things that we're going to be doing with this new position to help us. At the city level, the mayor has hired a chief equity officer for the city. And our agency was fortunate enough to be part of an equity pilot across, I think, 10 different city agencies. as this new equity officer is building out a strategic plan for the city that we're then going to help implement into our department.
Thank you. So Curry, I know you put a lot of thought into this issue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to talk about it. Thanks, Jamie, for the question. So the city of Seattle on the whole has something called the Race and Social Justice Initiative. All departments are required to look at something we call the Race and Social Justice Toolkit. So very thoughtful about how we match all of what we're doing, policies, programs, projects, and budget decisions to these outcomes that are spelled out in the toolkit. Each department also then puts together an RSJI plan. And all of your programs, as I mentioned, and your strategic plan then has to be tied to those things. So it becomes a regular part of what we do across all departments. So that's super exciting. And then at the end, we're just getting ready at the end of the year or the beginning of this year, then we do a presentation to the council on what our accomplishments have been, what are the challenges that we see, and how are we going to move forward. Then also some of the things individually that emergency management is doing is one of the really exciting and successful programs we have is something called, we use community safety ambassadors, who are trusted partners in different community organizations, most of who speak another language. And so they help us with outreach, they do classes in those other languages, and are really that, kind of culture broker that has a connection to government and a connection to those community organizations, and they're able to help us spread that message. We have a lot of community partners. There's also something called the Trusted Community Partner Network that the King County has done that looks at what are those organizations that you might connect with countywide and help you connect to those other groups that you may not be thinking about So Seattle in particular has been really thoughtful about it. It is something though that we constantly have to think about. I think emergency management as a profession tends to go toward communities that need more help, don't have resources, are more vulnerable. We do that because that's part of what we do. Those are the people that are going to need the most help. But there's always the opportunity, like all of us have been saying continually, is who are we missing and who may not know yet. So I'm very glad you asked the question. And yeah, without resilient communities, we can't, and that community building that we need to be part of, we can't do this work. So thanks for that.
Thank you all. So I'm going to turn it over to John or Tom now. I do want to thank Chris and Curry and Matt, as well as all the great questions that came in. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. And actually, fortunately, I wrote about a page of additional questions during your conversations we didn't get to. But panelists, thank you. And now I turn it over to John, I think.
Ron, thank you very much. I appreciate your help in bringing Chris and Matthew and Curry to this team. I think I appreciate how transparent you could be on some of these questions that were being sent your way, and we knew there were going to be some of those tough ones that you handled, and we sure do certainly appreciate all of that. So with that, we'll move on to the next session, and thank you for your time, guys.